Welcome to Ask the Hard Questions. I don't define a Christian by what's stitched on a hoodie or printed on a sign out front. I define it the way the fruit forces you to define it, by which voice governs the system. If your good news runs on the not under the law engine, an engine that treats God's commandments like an obstacle and obedience like a threat, then that's the religion you're practicing, no matter how many times you say the name Jesus. But a disciple of Jesus is measured by something the Sunday stage keeps dodging. Moses honored, the Son obeyed, the Father feared, and God's commands treated as life, never as a curse to escape. Prophets didn't sell loopholes. The Jerusalem witnesses didn't market comfort as salvation. Jesus didn't hand out slogans. He called people to follow, at cost, with fruit. And I'm not doing this from softened English traditions that can turn a warning into a lullaby and a command into a suggestion. I work from the earliest recoverable original Greek, with Bedag and Brill guiding definitions, because I'm not bowing to an English idol built on layers of editorial decisions, headings, punctuation, and manufactured breaks that can hide the teeth of the text. We're here to read what was written, define what the words mean, and let the record hit the Sunday system the way it was meant to hit it. Not what sells, not what soothes, what's true. Tonight's episode is The Straight Marriage Lie, because nothing exposes the hypocrisy faster than watching not under the law people pretend they're the guardians of biblical marriage. They'll scream about everyone else's union while their own doctrine dissolves the very covenant terms that make marriage anything more than paperwork. They want God as a witness while rejecting God as king. They want covenant language without covenant loyalty. They want to shout abomination while standing on a foundation that can't define sin, can't define holiness, and can't define marriage without borrowing the law they claim is gone. Funny how the law disappears when it restrains lust and greed, but magically reappears when they want a club in their hand. We're going to drag the hidden question into the light. How can you claim a marriage before God while denying the law of God, the very yoke that defines covenant? If you won't carry His commands, what exactly are you calling holy? We'll break down equally yoked, we'll expose the missing third in the yoke, and we'll follow the logic all the way to its end. Because you don't get to jump back and forth across the Jordan depending on what shoes you're wearing today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I don't do this for money, so if you want more truth like this, like and subscribe. Today's lesson, The Straight Marriage Lie. Not under the law equals no marriage. Ask the hard questions. Season 1, Episode 3. You want to talk about hypocrisy? Start right here. A straight marriage preached by people who swear they are not under the law is not covenant. It's cosplay. It's two people signing paperwork and then borrowing God's name to make it sound holy. That's why I laugh when Christian followers of Paul start barking about marriage definitions. You don't even have a definition. You have a slogan. Because marriage is not a vibe. It's not a tax filing status. It's not a ring, a dress, a playlist, and a pastor's microphone. Marriage, biblically, is a covenant yoke. And a yoke has direction. A yoke has boundaries. A yoke has a master. And this is the part they don't think about. This is the part they don't want anyone to ask out loud. How can you be married before God while denying God's law, the very covenant terms that define the union? How can you claim the witness while rejecting the standard He witnesses to? How can you preach God joined us while you preach God's commandments don't apply? They scream not under the law like it's a magic spell that dissolves accountability. Then they turn around and act like they're the gatekeepers of what's biblical. That's not discipleship. That's theft. They want the authority of Torah without the obedience of Torah. They want the status of holy without the cost of holiness. They want God's courtroom language while living like the courtroom burned down. A covenant yoke has 3. They keep deleting the third because the third comes with commands. Torah already drew the picture. Lo taharosh beshor uvahamor yachtav. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. Deuteronomy 22:10. A yoke demands shared direction. If you deny the king's direction, you denied the yoke. You're not equally yoked, you're equally ungoverned. And Scripture doesn't treat marriage like private romance. God stands as witness. That means accountability. That means terms. That means judgment when the terms are violated. Yod he vav he, heid beincha uvein eshet neurecha, vehi chavertecha ve'eshet beritecha. Yod he vav he has been witness between you and the wife of your youth. She is your companion and the wife of your covenant. Malachi 2:14. Read it slow. Wife of your covenant. Covenant means commandments. Covenant means fidelity measured by God's standard, not your mood. And the Creator's definition isn't a suggestion. Therefore a man shall leave and cling, and the two shall become one flesh. Genesis 2:24. Yeshua doesn't loosen it, he tightens it and puts God back in the middle as the active yoker. Ho theos sinezuxen, anthropos me chorizeto. What God yoked together, let no man separate. Matthew 19:6. God yoked, not we felt, not we manifested, not we signed. God yoked. That's the third. That's the witness. That's the authority. So if you remove God's law, you remove God's yoke. You can keep your ceremony. You can keep your rings. You can keep your Christian playlist. But don't call it covenant while preaching lawlessness. No law, no covenant. No covenant, no God-defined marriage. And this is exactly why their moral panic is laughable. They posture like they're defending biblical marriage, but their own doctrine dissolves the foundation they claim to stand on. They don't want Torah as authority, only as a prop. They don't want commandments as covenant, only as a club. They don't want God as king, only as a brand sticker. They'll say, marriage is sacred. Then they'll preach, not under the law. They'll say, God defines it. Then they'll say, God's commands are not binding. They'll say, sin is real. Then they'll say, the law doesn't define sin. They'll say, don't judge me. Then they'll judge everybody with a law they refuse to obey. You can't claim covenant while rejecting covenant terms. You can't swear allegiance to the king while rejecting his commands. You can't scream grace as an excuse and then borrow holiness as a weapon. And let's get blunt. Equally yoked is not, he's rich and she listens. That's not a yoke. That's a leash. That's not covenant. That's a contract. That's not love. That's managed silence bought with comfort. And the not under the law system produces exactly that kind of marriage because it replaces obedience with power. It replaces righteousness with optics. It replaces mutual submission to God with hierarchy games, image control, and selective enforcement. That's why they're quick to define other people's unions while refusing to examine their own. Because if you ask the right question, their whole stage collapses. Here's the right question. Which is it? Are we under the law? Or are we not under the law for all? Because not under the law means you don't get to run back to the law when it's convenient. You don't get to hop the Jordan depending on what shoes you're wearing today. You don't get to deny the standard and then claim the standard gives you authority. That's double-minded. That's a forked tongue. That's Rome. Law for you, loopholes for me. If your doctrine is not under the law, then stop pretending your marriage is under God. Stop invoking biblical marriage while preaching the removal of biblical authority. Stop slapping Jesus on a system that refuses his yoke. Because his yoke is not a slogan, it's submission to the Father's will. Arate ton zigon mu efhimas, mathete ap emu. Take my yoke upon you, learn from me. Matthew 11:29. Learn what? His commands, his way, his standard, his righteousness. And that's the core hypocrisy. They want God to endorse their straight marriage while they reject the covenant framework that makes any marriage of God at all. They want to shout abomination at everybody else while living in the abomination of lawlessness. A marriage claiming God's name while denying God's terms. That's not a leg to stand on. That's a stage built on fog. So I'm not impressed by heterosexual boasting. A man and woman can still build an anti-God marriage if they reject God's authority. Gender isn't the test. Obedience is. Covenant isn't defined by your attraction, it's defined by the King's commands and the faithfulness that proves you actually belong to Him. If you want to speak about marriage with God in your mouth, then put God back in the middle where He belongs, as witness, as King, as the one who defines and judges covenant. Anything else is paper and performance. Ask the question they fear. How can you be yoked to God in marriage while refusing His yoke in life? If you won't carry His law, stop claiming His covenant. Love, Eric Osborne. Ask the hard questions. Hashtag EricSeeksTruth. Thank you for watching today. If this hit a nerve, follow, like, and subscribe at EricSeeksTruth, Eric Osborne, on Facebook, Messenger, Instagram, and YouTube. I'll leave you with this. If you preach not under the law, what exactly makes your marriage God's and not just government paperwork? If covenant has a witness, why do you want the witness without the covenant terms? If God joins what He defines, how do you claim He joined you while rejecting His definition? If the yoke has three, why do you keep deleting the third when He shows up with commands? If obedience is bondage, why do you still demand everyone treat your union as holy on sight? If you can't define sin without the law, what are you even calling righteousness in your home? If God's commandments don't govern your vows, then what does? Feelings? Money? A pastor's mic? A courthouse stamp? If you insist the law is nailed away, why do you resurrect it the moment you want to police someone else? If the standard is gone, what makes you qualified to enforce standards? If you have to borrow Torah only when it benefits your outrage, what does that say about your gospel? Because here's the question that ends the game. If your own marriage can't be defined by God's law, then who are you to defend anything? Love, Eric Osborne. Hashtag no buts allowed. Ask the hard questions. Hashtag EricSeeksTruth.